welcome, I'm Spellsinger and this channel is here to review gamebooks in general, beginning with the Fighting Fantasy series. And the first one we're going to look at is the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Now there's many channels on YouTube which provide micro reviews, which is fine, they're great, you can get a nice little snapshot of your favourite books, but I really wanted to do a more in-depth review. So I put together this channel to work my way through the series of books, and then maybe when we get to the end I'll look at some of the other books that are around in that time, maybe Bloodsword or Lone Wolf, Way of the Tiger. There was a lot back in the day, and if they work out and there's lots of interest, then I will look at some of the more modern books, perhaps those by Victoria Hancock, who wrote the Cluster of Echoes series. But for now we're going to work through these. And the way this is going to work is for each book, for this first video in fact, I'll do a quick origins explanation. So Fighting Fantasy Origins, just to explain where these actually came from. There's going to be some people watching that haven't the faintest clue what these are about, but I imagine most of the people watching this will have at least an idea of where these have come through. Then I'll go through each subsequent video, will have the title and the book number. And I'll read the blurb of the book. So I've got my own copy here. I'll go through the blurb and just explain what that's all about. And then maybe move on to the game mechanics. So game mechanics are going to be different for each book, and even look at the adventure sheet and describe how that changes. Then we'll go through the plot and maybe have a look at the artwork. I'll run the artwork throughout this video so you can sort of see what the artist was trying to put across based on the descriptions. And then we'll look at the, we'll go through some likes and dislikes, and basically end up with some fun facts if I can find out any more that haven't already been found out, bearing in mind these books are quite old now. And then we'll end on the summary, and I'll give it a score out of 10. And finally, if I can find an appropriate shout out, then I'll mention another YouTuber who, if you like this video, you will definitely like theirs. They may even be the ones that inspired me to do this video as well. So let's start with a Fighting Fantasy Origins. Now these books, they basically were pure escapism back in the day, and a typical afternoon after school is you would drop your bag, grab one of these books and start working your way through them. And they really were a way to sort of leave everything behind and immerse yourself into a world of fantasy. And you could do it alone, or you could read these with friends, you know, and swap books. And that was a typical afternoon for me throughout school, I seem to remember. And I think that they were I would say they were responsible for a lot of creativity as well, not just for myself, but it really did open up your mind to sort of how to create these worlds, and I think it's probably responsible for a lot of my writing as well. So, but yeah, the Fighting Fantasy, it's a series of role-playing game books basically, and they were created by Steve Jackson and Sir Ian Livingstone. Now they were originally published by Puffin back in the day, 1982, so that's when this one came out. Now Puffin held on to them for a long time until Wizard Books took over in about 2002. And they re-released a lot of the books, but they did they did release some new ones as well. And then they'd had enough, and Scholastic Books took over in 2017, and they still own the rights now. So they're still pumping these books out. In fact, at the time of this recording, which is August of 24, we have got 1 week until the latest book comes out by Ian Livingstone, and that is called The Dungeon of Blood Island, I think it is. So that's coming out. So there's still a lot of, there's still a desire for these books. There's definitely a market for them. So they're still writing them, and it'd be nice to see some interest from some other authors, perhaps. The Fighting Fantasy series, they use a dice system to resolve combat. So combat is quite a big thing in these books. So as well as a narrative, you'll have lots of situations where you have to make decisions. You are the protagonist, basically. So you're the one that makes these choices by turning to different pages in the book. So you'll start on page 1, reference 1. You don't read subsequently through the book. You basically start on reference 1, and you will read the choices at the bottom of that page. And then it will tell you which reference to turn to. Now, most of these books had about 400 references. Some had more, some had less. But generally, if you got to a reference that said turn to 400, you knew you'd finished the book. Many of the books take place in a single world called Titan, which is the world that was created by Jackson Livingstone. And the stories basically are situated in different parts of that world. Typically, the game books follow a kind of collect A, B, and C to reach D kind of approach. And this means that the player can reach the end of the book by following, the correct path and finding any essential items that will help them resolve it. The later books sometimes varied this formula and allowed multiple routes to success. So, for example, most of the early books are quite linear. Some of the authors they prefer that kind of approach, but other books, they were more open world, and you could explore your way through the books, knowing that you could come back on yourself and explore, a bit like video games, which are obviously the digital media that were coming in and eventually put these books on the shelf, as it were. But if you're interested, there is a Titanica website where you can get a description of all these books, and every detail about them is in that Titanica website. That's a good site. That's about it for a very quick background. So way I'm going to do this is start with, like I mentioned earlier, the title and the book number. So this one is The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, book 1, funnily enough. And this is where it all began. And it really did start something major. Let me read you the blurb and give you an idea about what this one is all about. So your quest is to find the Warlock's treasure, hidden deep within a dungeon populated with a multitude of terrifying monsters. You will need courage, determination, and a fair amount of luck if you are to survive all the traps and battles and reach your goal, the innermost chambers of the Warlock's domain. Now, you don't get an awful lot from that, but at least you can... when they were on the shelves, obviously you can only get these on eBay these days, but when they were on the shelves, they did give you a little insight into what kind of book you might be getting. There were lots of genres. Most of them were a typical kind of medieval fantasy world, but there were some sci-fi and horror books as well. Typically the sci-fi ones didn't seem to do as well, but I didn't mind them, to be honest. I quite liked them. Okay, let's take a look at the plot. Now, as I mentioned, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone were the co-founders of the Games Workshop, and they authored the first 7 books in this series. And then as they became more popular, they employed basically other writers, and it became Jackson Livingstone Presents as opposed to just them. So with this one, Warlock of Firetop Mountain, this one you start off as a hardy adventurer, and you approach the mountain knowing that there's this great wealth in there hoarded by this terrible wizard by the name of Zagor. And basically all you do is you go into this mountain and you work your way through it, all the catacombs and tunnels and caverns and rooms, and you pick up all these items along the way and fight your way through, and then you get to this halfway point, which is like a river that runs through this mountain, and then cross that, and that's kind of like I said, the halfway point of the book. So you know you're almost there, and then you get this section of this horrible maze of Zagor, it's called, and as a child is as far as I got, and I think maybe that I could say the same for a lot of other people. It's a horrible dungeon, but it's very well designed, so it's like a very clever, but unless you map it, it's a very difficult maze, but very important because some of the essential items in there can be found. And once you get through that, you fight your way through to the final boss, which is Zagor. And the interesting thing about him is that you don't have to do a bog standard battle just to defeat him. There are other ways of doing it. There are items that you can find throughout the dungeon that you've just managed to get through that you can use to fight him. And then once you defeat him, you have his treasure chest, which is obviously locked. Now, hopefully, as you battle your way through his mountain, you found certain keys. Now, this is quite clever because there's a whole bunch of keys with numbers written on them that relate to the references. Eventually, when you get to the end, you see how many keys you've got, you add up the total numbers on the key, and you move to that reference. And if it makes absolutely no sense, then you basically not done it right. There's all kinds of red herring keys in there as well, but there are 3 main keys in particular that when you move to the reference that they add up to, click, the chest opens and you've done it. And it gives you a funny little option at the end, which doesn't lead to anything, but basically insinuates that you can either leave or remain as the new Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which I always thought was quite funny. But that's basically the story, and it's a really good opening book. It kind of introduces you to the world, and you can understand how everything works in this book for all the following books. So it really does work as an initial book. Let's have a look at the artwork. So like I said, I've been running the artwork throughout this video, and Russ Nicholson was the illustrator for this one, and he comes back in a lot of books later on, and his attention to detail is amazing. He really stands out. His work, it takes the description in the subsequent page, and he really brings it to life, and you kind of get a really good feeling of this mountain that you're inside and all the terrible things that you have to face. There was one picture that I, as a kid, used to freak me out a lot. I'll bring it up here. It's very odd because it sort of depicts this statue that comes to life, but there was always this weird emphasis on the butt, and I just thought that was a bit creepy. And I don't know. It's a bit odd. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, that's the artwork, and the artwork plays a really big part in these books, not just to give you an idea about what's happening, but sometimes clues are hidden in the book's pictures as well. So there might be numbers or references or some kind of involvement, like, you were in a room, you see a guy with coins, how many coins does he have? And you literally have to count the coins in the picture and then move to that reference, but they'll be like very subtly hidden as well. But that was quite nice, a little bit of interaction. So the artwork played a part in the story as much as anything else, just not just there to give you an idea of what you're looking at, but it was as much a driving force for the narrative as the descriptive writing. So some of the things that I liked and disliked about the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I mean, it is the original book, and it's really strong. It has a good narrative. And it's like I say, a good introduction into this series. You get the best of both authors as well, which is, like I said, something that's not happened since. It'd be great if that could happen again. Other authors have collaborated. Jamie Thompson and Mark Smith, who we'll touch on later on in the series, they collaborated, but we haven't had Jackson and Livingston since this book, so it'd be really great if they could do it again. But like I say, you get the best of both. You get Ian's incredible creatures, essential items, and random instant deaths, and his general linear style to writing these books. And then, like I say, you get to this halfway point where Steve took over, and you've got his more open world and maybe some slightly more imaginative creatures. His creatures that he came up with, I'm sure, are they're not your typical orcs and goblins. They're really off the top of his head, and he always does bring something new to his books in terms of the encounter. So I really like that about them. I suppose the only thing I disliked, which was probably just because of my age, was this maze of Zagor that I mentioned. It was a real tough challenge to get through that, and even if you mapped it, it was written in a way that it was still difficult to get through, get the key item, and then get out again. Lots of secret doors, and I spent a long time trying to get through that. But it's quite rewarding when you do get through it. So a couple of fun facts about this book, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Now, given that it's been around since 1982, most things are known. Some of the interesting things are its initial name was The Magic Quest. That was the working title for a while, and then when it was finally finished, they came up with what it is now. Livingstone and Jackson, like I say, wrote this, but they wrote it in sections. So as far as I understand, Livingstone wrote the first half up to this river that kind of acts as a divide in the book, and then Jackson took over and finished it. Now, you would expect to tell. If you've read enough of these books, you could tell the difference between Livingstone's style of writing and Jackson's. And you would think that that would show in this book, but it doesn't, because apparently Steve went back and didn't change Livingstone's writing, but worded it in his style so that it's a little bit more consistent, which kind of makes sense. Otherwise, it would stand out a lot. There is a weird orphan reference in this book that you can't reach with any number. I think it's reference 192, and it's a combination of the keys, but I understand that when they finished the book, they had 399 reference, and they thought, well, let's try and finish on 400. So they created an orphan reference and just chucked it in there to make up the numbers. But yeah, that's something I heard about, but I didn't realise it was that reference. But yeah, 192, it's an orphan record. Just to touch on the adventure sheet, every book had an adventure sheet. It was just a place where you could keep a record of all your stats and items you gain. So you can see the adventure sheet here. At the top there, you've got skill, stamina, and luck, and that was present in, like I say, every single Fighting Fantasy book, certainly in the Greenspine series. And then typically you would have your equipment list, where you would just note all your items that you picked up. Sometimes it would be a notes in there, but typically you would have gold, jewels, potions. This is what I call like a standard sheet. They did change throughout the series as different authors came in. They would put in their own attributes and just mix it up a little bit. And it was good for variety, but this was like a general sheet. And then at the bottom there, you've got your provisions, which is obviously your meals. And then the monster encounter boxes is just a place where you used to keep a record of all your encounters. And then you would note their skill and stamina and then make changes as the fight went on. But yeah, that is generally the standard adventure sheet that you found in the front of all these books. Okay, so let's do a summary of this book, and then at the end we'll give it a score out of 10. Structurally, it's pretty simple. The dungeon design prior to the river is basically a straight line. It's quite linear. There's a few branches here and there, but you very quickly find yourself being diverted back to the main path if you stray too far. You need 3 keys at the end to unlock the Warlock's chest. But there's no guarantee that you will find them, and you will probably even find some of the red herring ones, like I mentioned earlier, that will lead you astray. This isn't a game book that rewards is sort of intelligent decision making as such. You can simply fail by choosing to go left instead of right at times. But it does reward persistence and mapping. I would always recommend the mapping. But it also rewards exploration over the course of multiple reads. So it's always good to map so you can save time later on. But yeah, from a structure standpoint, the Maze of Zagor is probably the most impressive thing in the book, even though it's so tough. The way it's written makes it quite disorientating. And unless you do map it, you're going to struggle. There are all kinds of teleport traps strewn about, which make it really difficult, and some random encounters. But sadly, it's also quite frustrating. As I've already mentioned, I used to get stuck there back as a kid a lot. The confrontation with the Warlock is really well done, with a number of fun options. So instead of just getting there and having a bog standard battle where you're just rolling dice, you can fight it out with your sword. That's fine. You can also have a potion of invisibility, I think you can pick up somewhere, which will help. Or you can lessen his power by burning his enchanted cards that he's always carrying. Or you can go for this instant kill by using the Eye of the Cyclops, I think it was. But the game books, yeah, they're always improved, and when they are multiple paths to victory, I find, instead of like a bog standard fight. So I'm really glad they did this with the opening book. They do it in the next book, which we'll do next review. You get to the boss and you've got lots of different options to fight him, as opposed to just rolling some dice and then it's all over like all the other encounters. So that's really nice touch. In terms of the game design, there are some tough fights, but most can be avoided in this one. The book can be completed with quite low skill, stamina, and luck. There's this funny little tagline, if you like, in the instructions to these books that says, regardless of your initial rolls, you should be able to complete this book without too much difficulty, which is complete nonsense in most of these books. You need high skill, especially in Livingstone's books. Some of his books with a skill lower than 11, you can't do it. But in this one, you can. There's lots of chances to get your luck back. your stamina and your skill. So if you do take injury or run through your luck quickly, there's plenty of places where you can replenish those and get through with sort of meager stats. I think the Iron Cyclops is probably the toughest battle, unavoidable combat. And in its point in the series, they claim that, like I say, that an adventurer can make it through is still a true one, I think. So generally, the encounters written by Steve are more interesting, like I mentioned. He provides the player with lots of options and originality. Ian's Half of the Dungeon has a greater variety of characters, but many of them are quite simple, your goblins and your bats and whatnot. Steve's half comes through quite heavily on atmosphere, which I really like. There's some really creepy stuff going on in that second half of the book. But the maze, while it's well designed, can be quite tedious. I don't mean to harp on about that maze, but it scarred me from the 80s. I think I need to credit Russ Nicholson as well. Like I mentioned earlier, he's got some brilliant atmospheric stuff in there, loaded with detail. We always, you have to look at his pictures closely. They've got so much detail in them, more so than I can, off the top of my head, more so than any of the other authors in this series. Very solid, well designed, and great illustrations. The mechanics. This book is defined on its mechanics. And it kind of gives you a good platform for understanding those for all the later books. The rules are functional. I like the restrictions on the eating provisions in this one. Generally, in most of the books that follow, you can just eat when you want, as long as it's not in battle. But in this book, it tells you when you can eat, and that's the only time. So you've got to be a little bit careful with that. So that's quite good. And I like the magic sword effect. The attack strength was always a bit of an issue. I always had a problem with that. As a kid, you were always told that you couldn't go over your initial skill, and then later on, having lost no skill points, you get a sword and it say, "Oh, add 2 to your skill," and you think, "Well, I can't, can I? Because I can't go over my initial skill." But in this one, they'll say something like, "You get a magic sword, add 2 to your next attack strength, or add 2 to your attack strength from here on." Which works better. You don't have to worry about not understanding the skill rules, You can just add 2 to your attack strength and that's it. That's how it should be, I think. And it would really work for the rest of the books, but they didn't learn. But anyway, it's a solid book. There's a lot of attention to the rules here. They didn't all carry forward, and that attack strength one was one of them, and the provisions one, eating, being told when you can eat, that was another, but each author brought something to these books, so I can't complain about that. The monsters, most of the monsters here are kind of old school D&D standard. Some of them are quite memorable. There are a few throwaway encounters, but particularly in the middle section, from the portcullis to the river. For those of you who know, they're pretty standard, but for most part, the encounters are really, really good. They're very well done. So what would I give this out of 10? I mean, it's the first book. I think I would give this book a 7 out of 10. It's a great read. It really is. It is, like I say, it's the first, it's original, and it gets you ready for the rest. It's not too difficult. It doesn't put you off, but it does set you up nicely to get into all the other books. That's my summary. I said I was going to do a shout out. I think if I was going to do a shout out, I would do one for someone who is a good YouTuber. They've got some great videos on these books. They're very passionate about it. They do live streams, and you can find them on YouTube under the name of Adam Pestridge. He's really great, actually. He's very passionate about these books, and like I say, he does fortnightly reviews, fortnightly read-throughs rather, and gets the chat involved in reading through these books, which is a bit of a laugh. It's nice to get in touch with people who are into these as well. That would be a good place to sort of, if you like this video, you will love what he does. I think that's about it. So that is the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. What I'm going to try and do is work my way through all these books. There were 69 in the Green Spine series. That's how I call the Puffin range green spine series, hence the green spine. What I'm going to try and do is read through to recap, and then I'll review them. So I'll do the next book, which is The Citadel of Chaos, and Steve Jackson wrote that one. That was a solo book for him. And we'll see what that one is like. If you found this helpful or you liked it or whatever, give it a thumbs up. If you fancy, if you have some ideas about how I can improve or some constructive criticism, just leave a comment. And if you really liked it, then subscribe, and I will keep doing these as long as there's some need for them or some interest. But yeah, for now, thank you so much, and I'll catch you in the next one.